So you mentioned what happened with the stocks the day of the notice of proposed rulemaking. And I guess I'm just a little bit confused because the day that the final rule was released, the stocks of a lot of those companies skyrocketed.
Oh,
because, I mean, they got to the yellow zone, they weakened the metrics. Yeah. And it just doesn't make any sense to me that the rule would be so much weaker if the process was so corrupt, like you said.
Here's what happened. You know how they have the saying on Wall Street that certain things get factored in like immediately, and then when the second shoe gets dropped, they've already factored it in. The big drop took place last year. It happened after the GAO report. It happened when Department of Education released their proposed regulation in July, and they looked at it and go, wow, this is going to be very, very draconian, and it takes place upon enactment or very shortly thereafter. What happened on June 2nd, which is the final rule, surprised a lot of people on both sides, which is, as you pointed out, while they left many of the metrics the same, they changed the enforcement period to the date when it becomes a working regulation. It put it out 3 years. So the market at that point, which had already discounted, there's already billions off and 20% or more off the value of these shares, that had already been priced in. That was the phrase I was trying to remember. And so when it came out and said, oh, well, it'll start in 3 years, they go, oh, 3 years. And went back in. And the market is good at overreacting in either direction. And I think essentially that's what happened. And that's the reason why, even though the metrics didn't change, the enforcement period did. And the other thing that, at least in the financial pages, when you look at it, people who saw that this had raised a ruckus. There were 90,000 comments on this, which is a record for the Department of Education regulation. You can comment during the regulatory period, and most of them were against it. So, and all the bad press. So when you have all of those things, I think the average investor out there who's looking at it is saying, well, this thing is radioactive, and now it's not even going into effect for 3 years. A lot can happen in 3 years. We predict that its wings will get pinned back. And I think that's the reason stocks actually went up on June 2nd this year when it went final, but stocks went down last year in the heat of the controversy before the GAO report became discredited.
I mean, didn't the rule get weakened in other ways other than just being delayed?
There were some, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there were some in terms of metrics and so forth. The big argument was the argument I briefly alluded to, which is this. If you're going to tell a student that they can't get financial aid to school X because a previous graduating class from school X defaulted because perhaps unemployment, people who go to the trade schools don't have the 800 SATs, etc., and they're going to have a hard time finding jobs. And so I think what happened, I think that explains what was happening there. And as an aside, a lot of you look like you may have just graduated from college. You may know lots of people. I have a daughter who graduated from the University of Virginia Law School in Stanford, and she's emailing all her friends, and a lot of them don't have jobs yet. In the old days, it used to be, kind of the limos and come work with us, and here's a signing bonus and all that stuff. Those days are gone. And if that's for schools of that caliber, when you get down to a plumbing course or a hairdresser course or something like that in the middle of the type of unemployment that we have now, which is the worst essentially since the Depression, I'm surprised that default rates aren't higher. It doesn't mean that the education was worthless. It could mean that employment across the board is pretty bleak, and at the minimum, I think it was good that they made it 3 years, but at the minimum, I think that's just fairness. And so that they stretch it out like that. To answer your question briefly, there were some other changes in the metric. That was largely because of the outcry. The original proposed version was very, very draconian, and to talk to the short sellers, they wanted it even more draconian. If they had their way, they'd say, you can't get any kind of federal money and go to these schools. They have put together so many different things, but again, what's their motive? Their motive is to make a lot of money. If the motive is to make a lot of money, and you pass a reg that destroys the value of all those companies, then you've made even more money than if it's a reasonable reg. And so, as I say, I focus less on the policy and more on the process, but that's just a bad process.
Very much on the Association of Private Sector Colleges and Universities. I would ask you what you think about media bias towards career colleges. Because from our vantage point, the kind of media often doesn't look like the good stories, the good kinds of things that career colleges are doing. We want to focus instead on the bad aspects. And what do you think that's driven by the short sellers, or do you think this is some innate bias amongst the media, some elitist bias against trade schools? What do you think is going on?
So the question is about media bias regarding these schools and the perception that the good news stories coming out of these for-profit institutions don't get reported, but the bad news stories do. I think it's true. I mean, it doesn't look to me as if there is an even playing field between the sort of the traditional not-for-profit institutions of higher education and the American dream that sort of everyone sees going through that. And these often newer, often less well known, often without a quad and pretty trees, don't fit that stereotype. They don't get a fair treatment. It's a shame. I mean, the U.S. education sector broadly needs a lot of reform. Higher education is included in that, and in many cases, these can be profoundly important institutions in driving those reforms and giving people access to the education. So I can't fully explain it. It can be very frustrating. And the fact that there are bad apples in everything. I was a college professor for 20 years, and I can name some not-for-profits that I don't think very highly about. It's a shame that taints the perception of the entire sector.
Well, and there was actually a negative PR campaign that accompanied this. That was very well documented. They had a woman who was misrepresenting herself, going to homeless shelters, saying, "Have you ever heard of somebody from a homeless shelter being recruited? Why don't you sign this letter to the Secretary of Education?" She misrepresented who she worked for. She worked for one of the short sellers out of Texas. And then there was the Village Voice piece. The Village Voice did a story last summer called For-Profit Blues. The freelance writer, who had been a freelancer for the New York Daily News and other papers, shows up with this story. And it appealed to the editor who ran it. For-Profit Blues interviewed a young woman who had gone through school, racked up a lot of debt, couldn't complete or couldn't get a job, and it turned out she didn't exist. But it gets worse, because the same article says, well, then we went to the school that she went, and I think it was Berkeley Colleges, not to be confused with Berkeley University, and they talked to a person there, and they quoted the person, except the person said, "I never talked to this guy." It gets worse yet. Then they quoted a Matt Frazier from the GAO, who was going to talk about this GAO sensational study. The only problem was, after the Village Voice ran the story, they got a call from the GAO. "We don't have anybody named Matt Frazier here." So it was a trifecta of falsehoods, and the Village Voice, which is, it's a well-known newspaper. I mean, it's not maybe top 10 or anything, but there is a certain degree of bias against these schools, so that something could come up that's totally falsified like that was, and not be fact-checked and just be thrown in as a story. Now, to their credit, the Village Voice ran an apology. We apologized to our readers. This was false. We checked it. We were stunned. It wasn't just false. It was made up false. And the distinction, I think, between community colleges, which have a valuable role too, and a lot of it's the same personnel, and for-profits are this. For-profits actually pay taxes. For-profits don't take money from the taxpayer. I think a 4-year education at a community college costs a taxpayer roughly $32,000, I think it is. That's far more than what happens at a for-profit school. And for-profit schools are willing to teach certain types of trade courses that, for whatever reasons, are beneath the other educational opportunities, and they're more willing to provide classes in the evenings and weekends,